Good morning, everybody. This presentation is essentially a sort of light-hearted but with a serious centre look at some issues I see as quite concerning for our research world. And by our research world, I'm sort of skewed towards the qualitative, as Ray said, but to some degree I'm talking about analysis of all research. And my tale takes the form of a little murder mystery. This is the case of the dead cat. I don't think I've ever known a time when there's been such a panoply of ideas, and indeed a huge and wide diverse methodological landscape, some of which we've been hearing about in the last two papers, in our world at the moment. We are completely abuzz with activity in new ways to reach, to research people and to research our worlds. But, you know, in the corner of this very thriving commercial landscape, there is lying a rather sick if not dead cat. And that cat, in the instance I'm talking about, is the intellectual, trained, sharp instrument that is qualitative, or indeed any analytical thinking in our world. But in the case of this particular dead cat, I want to just make the point that curiosity is actually not to blame. Indeed, I'm going to suggest that curiosity is precisely the hero of the hour that we need at this evolutionary stage in our research world to summon. So before I talk specifically about my take on curiosity, and I do have a very particular take on curiosity which I'll talk about, I just want to highlight some of the forces which I think are causing the analysis cat to sicken, if not die. So what seems to be the problem? As a scene setter, I'm going to sort of suggest really that what's going on in our worlds is that accessing has started to replace understanding. And by that I mean, in the last 10 years, we've experienced this complete revolution about how we access things, how we access people and how we access systems, how we find patterns of behaviour in the process that we call research. The revolution has been very largely methodological. It's been a revolution of the how and how to get stuff rather than necessarily how to machinate on those things that we're getting hold of. And you know, there's no process, there's no behaviour, no market, no population, no individual beyond our reach these days. Now we've got the internet, this access has absolutely exploded, and we can employ it to reach pretty much anyone we want. We can filter a morass of already collected data, we can locate and pin down hard-to-reach samples, we can develop networks, we can source communities, we can Google search terms, we can even spy on individuals, communities or behaviour patterns, and we can do all of this without even leaving our keyboards. So we do have this quite unprecedented level of access at our fingertips. And yet, you know, I think that all of this accessing is coming at a bit of a price. And I want to suggest that the price that it's coming at is the price of understanding. Because we don't really have the time and the effort left to employ our process of analysis on it. And this is really just a quick reminder. Perhaps unusually, something that Malcolm Gladwell said on the subject, but really just a reminder that understanding is the absolute essence and most important aspect of the research that we produce and do for our clients. And you know, it's absolutely our industry's heritage, and by that I mean us as research practitioners or insight creators, or however we like to describe ourselves these days. It's, you know, and without this kind of instinctive, intellectual and very human take on what we're doing, we are simply harvesters of data, and we've had this old argument in the past. And you know, Gladwell, he's keen to remind us in this comment, I think this was actually from Blake, that we are inevitably emotionally involved in our work, and John's just been talking a lot about emotion and how important it is, and we mustn't forget that it's very salient and very important in the process that we call research as well. So, you know, I think the other thing that's going on here is a rather bizarre situation, almost a kind of role reversal. You know, research buyers and marketing departments and manufacturing organisations have never been more open to and informed about the importance of emotions. I mean, you know, they've all read Sunstein and Thaler, they've heard of behavioural economics, they've probably heard John and Mark speak. They're pretty clued up on a lot of this stuff. The fact that we make 80% of our decisions with our lizard brains or our level 2 system, system 2, and its emotional response, the huge bully in our mental apparatus, is something which I think people are now increasingly familiar with. We know all this. We know all this when we're talking about consumer landscape. So how come in our professional lives we seem to be in a new era of coyness about our opinions? We've become distrustful of anything not validated by science or technology or, dare I say it again, numbers. So we're in an era of absolutely unprecedented research access, and yet, for some bizarre reason, we seem to have become newly obsessed or re-obsessed with the kind of means of transport rather than the quality of the journey, or more significantly, the destination. What is the reason we've fallen in love with process at the expense of understanding, and why are we letting the questioning, the listening, and other sourcing activities involved in research weigh so heavily that we've almost got no strength or stomach left for the incisive activity that is analysis? I want to point the finger at three key murder suspects here, and my first culprit in the case of the near demise of the analysis cat are those arch enemies of understanding, big data, and his sneaky sidekick high speed. They're a pretty frightening duo, and they're increasingly omnipresent in the research world these days. You know, it's interesting, isn't it, that big data has now got these kind of this sort of capitalized appellation, when actually what it describes applies chiefly to very, very, very small and often mind-bogglingly uninteresting but very large quantities of data. So it's big in size only. And you know, so much of our financially transacted experience now leaves a trail. Indeed, much of our socially constructed experience leaves a trail. It's unlikely, for example, that I couldn't find out a lot of things about probably everybody who's listening to this webinar in a few short clicks if I so desired. Because of the fabulous velocity, it means we're presented with a highly seductive possibility. We can get massive amounts of data for our clients, and we can get them very quickly. But you know, for the analysis cat, this is something of a perfect storm. Not least because you don't need to be a researcher with a Rolls-Royce brain tuned to make connections and provide valuable leaps for our clients, incidentally using our emotions. You don't need to be one of those to harvest data and deliver it fast. In fact, you don't even need to be human at all. My second culprit is something I'm going to call sort of the emperor's new co-created clothes, and this may be contentious for some of those listening. Co-created research findings have become so kind of fashionable, so sexy in our current culture. And because of the nature of our sort of capturing sources and methodologies, particularly, I'm thinking here of social media communities, respondent-sourced photos, things, diary accounts, ethnographic films, and so on, because it's very co-created, we have a sense that it's very democratic, it's very user-centric. And to some extent, we're seduced by that into thinking its authenticity amounts to superiority. It is, in a sense, seen as the answer in itself. And, you know, I kind of keep noticing that we're sort of inclined to believe that what once would have been called very raw data, or indeed just findings, has sort of started to become something which we hand over uncooked to our clients. I think the fact of things being co-created, rather interactive and openly sourced, all somehow promise a kind of new age of clarity. They're ideas that are very much part of the sort of postmodern web lexicon, really, the kind of lexicon of the 2.0 or even the 3.0 web. But, you know, I don't think it means necessarily that all this stuff has a kind of value or a meaning for our clients beyond the obvious. And indeed, I would probably suggest that what's often happening these days is what we once would have called verbatims are being served up as findings, and findings are being served up as conclusions. Okay, my last culprit, of which I'm going to point a finger really, I'm going to call simply the sort of web-based cultural tyranny, which is kind of arguably the internet itself, which I appreciate as a bit of a kind of rug puller, given that this is precisely how today's webinar is being enabled. But I want to suggest that we're living in a kind of era, particularly in research, where there's a kind of culture of pressure, where we're expected to revere everything and anything technological or internet-inspired as having a kind of distinct and very special cachet, a sort of contemporary superiority to anything emanated from more traditional sources. And I think that we hold internet-generated and even sort of typed comment, for example, in sort of greater and more literal esteem than, for example, researcher-heard and unrecorded viewpoint. I mean, contextually, things like, you know, our government, UK government, has employed Margolane Fox at quite a decent salary, actually, to force every last poor old pensioner to get online. And we're spending some very significant amounts of tax revenue in increasing broadband speed by milliseconds, and we decree that everybody must go digital by 2013. So this kind of persuasion towards the web is really quite tyrannical in some ways, and I think as researchers we are particularly prone to the experience of that tyranny. We even use very significantly ramped language when we describe everything that's kind of web-based or electronic. Like, I think the two classics here and often used are connected and community. They're very central descriptors in this environment, and they suggest something very cosy, positive, bustling, meaningful, and full of human activity. I mean, you know, in some regards, those tenets have to be seen as completely ironic. I'm just suggesting, in my last culprit and finger pointing then, that we've created a slightly false god of e-things, to which us as researchers have become high priests. And I just want to expand on that for a second, because I think we've got a kind of myopia, particularly related to material that has come from the internet, especially social media source qualitative data. It's pretty raw, it's pretty much anonymous and frankly very decontextualized, but we often treat it as very real, very authentic and meaningful. Just to throw out a couple of kind of caveat thoughts. What, for example, is the meaning of authenticity in the garnered responses with an online community or located via a brand Facebook page? In what mood or tone were comments made? Who was envisaged as the reader or the recipient? What effect was the blogger trying to create? How much was the approval or opprobrium of the brand ironic? Did your gizmo pick that up? Do we even have enough understanding about the kinds of language used in online or mobile communications? Have we really grasped the tenor of the post that started with OMFG? And would this kind of voice, the voice that we think we're picking up on the internet, in a blog, in a community response, would that even exist in the flesh? Would we hear or feel or experience somebody talking in that kind of stance if they were down the path? Or, worse still, maybe what we're picking up on the internet is in fact a sort of research bot that's been set loose to feign a consumer type. So rounding up these culprits in the search for a fatal blow for the analysis cat, I can see some more stark evidence here. And one of the effects of this tsunami of user-generated and under-analysed data, and here I am thinking about qualitative material, has been a sort of an appearance of a sort of, or maybe it's a revival of something which I'm inclined to describe as the bleeding obvious syndrome. As if the fact of having gathered data from online sources in crazy volumes and from so-called authentic or naturally occurring sources kind of obviates the need for intellectual evaluation of the findings. And these three are real examples of made public research, which all of which were conducted in online and quite complicated newfangled approaches. And you can see how stunning these bits of insight are from a very famous global accountancy firm who discovered through using some of these online methods that, amazing here really, personal recommendations made a big impact on what consumers buy. Finding 2, this is our government, who discovered, again pretty amazing, parents would like their children screened from pornographic websites. Finding 3, a very well-known music channel discovered the most important aspect of the proposed online offering will be, you can't believe it really, can you, but content. So, when you pick yourself up from the floor, hearing that lot, the way our world is moving is that we've been very tardy to highlight, I think, to our clients exactly why it is that the human researcher brain, with all of its emotional overlays, is a complete treasure trove of value for money. It's the thing that really absolutely should not be threatened by SurveyMonkey or DIY approaches, and we're not likely to be put out of a job if we can simply promote its use. Indeed, I would feel, frankly, we deserve our fate if we can't start shouting about the value we can bring to research. It seems to have been simply forgotten. A recent LinkedIn chat stand was entitled, "How long will it be before online community specialists and online providers begin a head-to-head competition for client attention with full-service agencies?" Guys, the writing is on the wall. And you know, the interesting thing about all these kind of analytics gizmos and the speed culture is I don't know a nation on earth that doesn't have somewhere in its heart a proverb based around the virtue of sleeping on it, or the virtue of coming to understand something in a more nuanced, considered and longer lasting way. So speed can be our enemy too. So I want to talk about curiosity. And I think curiosity is the skill that's become something of an endangered species in research, and particularly in qualitative research. And I want to be very particular in the way I talk about and define curiosity. It's in a very particular research sense. The kind of curiosity that I'm talking about is the real, sort of precursor to real insight generation. It starts from an almost childlike wonder state, and it goes on to fuel connection making. It's basically the engine oil that helps our minds make leaps using the jigsaw pieces, which include all kinds of things, from the client's problem, the findings, the marketing intentions, and so on and so forth. And you know, for the proto-neuroscientists and the behavioural economist enthusiasts out there, so something of interest here, that the state of being or feeling curious has been shown to relate to very high levels of brain activity in the emotional part of the brain, but it also activates both sides. So you get type 2 and type 1 thinking in a very healthy ratio when you experience a state of curiosity. So there you go. Being curious is actually good for you too. But you know, curiosity has had a very bad name. I think, you know, if we think about curiosity, it's always been associated with the less lovely aspects of human nature. It's only really an inch away from nosiness, gossip and tale-telling if we think about common usage. It's connoted with childishness and childhood. But above all else, it's associated with cats. And from here on, I want to talk to you a little bit about cats, because I think that the curiosity of cats has an enormous amount to commend it. You will see that cats are very rarely satisfied with a simple or a desultory explanation. And they aren't content to settle for the conditions around them. They often choose to test boundaries. They conduct experiments based on physics, logic, and possibly geography, and they aren't prepared to accept that behaviour patterns have only one explanation. You'll notice, have you ever tried, if you have a cat, to persuade your cat that it's actually 2 hours too soon for her food? No, well, it doesn't work, I can tell you. She'll start to experiment with a huge range of approaches intended to wear you down, and those will include yowling, sitting on your keyboard. I've just had to lock one out of the room that I'm in now, or to tripping you up on the way downstairs, purring loudly in your ear, and so on. She's very much driven to explore possibilities and push boundaries. So really, I think cats are the ultimate empirical researchers, and behavioural economics strongly suggests we should use much more empirical research, incidentally, testing out the physical world and the behaviour, pretty much to its destruction. They're pretty good at the ethnographic stuff too, of course. They understand all about inhabiting another's world to get an inside take on the situation. And curiosity, you know, requires quite a lot of bravery as well as a very open mind. Again, stuff that cats know all about. And in defence of curiosity, I just want to mention a couple of humans as well. John Humphreys, who I guess a lot of listeners will have heard of, but some may not have, especially here in the States. He's a very well-known UK radio journalist. He was recently asked on a web-based chat if being a good listener was the secret of being a successful radio journalist. And his reply to that was, oh no, for me it's curiosity. If you're curious, you always listen well. And I think that's a wonderful summation of my feelings about curiosity, which incidentally had been inspired by somebody called Gianfranco Cecchini, and he was a family therapist in the Milan group. Again, some of you may have come across these people. They were a group of psychotherapists who became renowned for developing some highly effective and powerful methods for both inquiring and also conceptualizing behavior change. And that was obviously in their patients, but read respondents when I talk about them. They were some of the first kind of postmodern psychologists to realize and put into practice the notion that relationship and context are intertwined. There are no kind of the final answers, and the final answers about thinking and what influences don't lie in the individual, reference mark there, but that the process of inquiry is in fact one in which reality is created rather than being found. So that's a real thought to hang on to. And their theoretical approaches have much to commend them, I think, today, and for researchers in particular. Most significantly, Cecchini suggests that the start point for one's inquiry, one's research process, whatever the kind of conundrum one is trying to look at or solve, should be this highly open-minded, curious state, which is not the same as objective or neutral. The Milan therapists realized very early on that neutrality was an illusion. So curiosity for them meant in part occupying the patient's world, for which obviously we responded, and in order to explore empirically the why of behaviour. And incidentally also not to make verbal demands of a sort of post-rationalised kind of why questioning. So fits very nicely with more recent behavioural economic thinking. Indeed, I think some of it was in the sort of seedbed to the development of what's now called behavioural economics. So I told you earlier that curiosity lights up both sides of the brain. So the other thing it does, incidentally, when you're in a state of curiosity, your short-term memory is also improved. So curiosity as a state to be in for research is extremely good for you. I'm just going to return to cats for a moment quickly, because they do remind us that curiosity needs to be a way of being, not a questioning approach. So a curious stance means exploring what seems to happen when patterns of behaviour occur, which incidentally are often leaked through language at a level beyond the simple transmission of answers. So I could talk a lot about discourse analysis, which is one of my favourite cultural methods, which actually can be used on, if you like, more traditional research kind of material. Systemic thinking, which the Milan therapists were the fathers of, if you like, suggests that we should use curiosity to move through a kind of inquiry cycle, which basically goes hypothesize, experiment, revise, hypothesize, experiment, revise, and so on. And you're always looking for what changes what. And a properly curious and key sort of verbal inquiry approach, because I do understand the limitations of the kind of why question, is something that's called circular questioning, which again I can't go into today, but is a fascinating approach if you do need to, or you're in a situation where a verbal approach to research is important. In essence, it focuses on the third person, much as these observing cats are doing in a way, and it disallows that sort of third-person accounting, or that kind of, the self-editing that often goes on and the post-rationalising that goes on if you ask people why about their behaviour. But there are more things in the curiosity-driven research trail than just the words. And as this cat bottom right can show us, the non-verbals are very important too. So cats have got mirroring down to a fine art. This is really a quick summary of the thoughts of the very particular type of curiosity I'm describing, but I'll move on fast from that because I think time will dictate really. I just strongly urge you to make friends with your own curiosity. So how do you go about achieving a perpetually curious stance, which would be in a sense the ideal stance for research? And there are a couple of good leads on this. Firstly, it's quite a good idea to forget yourself a little. Curiosity in research practice means regressing to being an intrigued child. You're kind of emptying yourself of yourself, which may mean you have to recognise your own disposition first, being kind of meditative, but also a little bit playful. It means being literally open or wide-minded, forced to be perpetually aware of context, and context is super important in research, and I think we've become more and more aware of the importance of context in recent thinking on research. Being aware of other ways of reading things, and you know that kind of curiosity does include a curiosity about yourself, so you may need to look at and then put to one side through a kind of reflexive process your own position, your own story, your own cultural leanings, your own tendency to believe, I don't know, market charts or whatever. Because very open and non-judgmental curiosity lets you see other worlds and different cultural contexts, and it also lets you soak up things which are very divergent in belief system terms to your own ones.
Hi Rosie, I need you to really go to the conclusion page.
Yeah, okay. I'm there. Okay, so, you know, as the analysis cat is concerned, I think we can revive it with a healthy dose of curiosity, and really, if only we can cut down these particular demons to size, and I think those demons are the ones I highlighted earlier. So, really, my last thought on the matter is that only really sometimes the human mind can do it, and indeed the emotional part into which we can feed the curiosity and even curious cats. Notice. Thank you very much for listening.